So I'll turn the meeting over to Professor Gunn.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I must say I think I'm in the company of experts on a subject that I like to think about, but spend much of my time sort of puzzling through. I write as somebody who's driven by curiosity and sometimes by consternation, not always or mostly by expertise. But that's been sort of the story of my life. I actually started out as a professor of religion. That's what my PhD is in. And I've had various iterations in other things like American studies and so on. I guess you would say, a fellow who likes to walk around. And I found that not only a lot of fun, but I've found it also something that has become more and more absorbing as more of my attention has turned toward issues having to do with global issues and the rest. I am going to be talking for about 40 minutes or so. I hope I'm not bringing coals to Newcastle. I'm talking at the Institute for World Culture, and of course I never put two and two together, or at least at my age that becomes more of an arduous effort. But I do know Nandini Iyer. I did not know her husband, but she was a very good friend of my late wife, and a good friend of mine too at a certain point. Not close, but good. So it's a joy for me to be here, and we'll just see where this takes us. My subject this afternoon involves, let's call it the utility, the usefulness of a cosmopolitan perspective. I'm not sure it's just a set of values. A cosmopolitan perspective in a global world, many of whose most serious challenges, I will be arguing, arise not just from geopolitical, social, and economic disputes between and across nation states, but also from inter- and cross-cultural misunderstandings and conflicts going on around and across nation states. By cosmopolitan, I think most people mean something like worldly, or universalist, or tolerant, or even civilized. But in truth, as I'm sure many of us would understand, there are almost as many versions of cosmopolitanism as there are brands of dry cereal. Cosmopolitanism not only comes in various kinds, political, economic, cultural, social, but has been recently described as everything from vernacular, or situated, or realistic, or patriotic, or Eurocentric, or emancipatory, or transgressive, or minoritarian, or subaltern, as thick or thin. Some people associate cosmopolitanism with the stoic affirmation of a moral community of humankind, where each person is a citizen and owes some kind of duty to every other, or with the later 18th century Kantian idea that everyone who enters the public sphere has a right to the free and unrestricted use of their own reason. Still other people identify cosmopolitanism with specific values, like, say, the recognition of human dignity and the expression of human freedoms. And some further believe that these values can be expressed in particular policies, dealing with everything from governance, security, and the regulation of the economy, to, as you'll be talking about next time, I think, environmental protections and the rest. Yet still others talk about cosmopolitanism as simply a process going on all around us, beyond the container, so to speak, of national and transnational spaces, processes that are creating new forms of global risk: nuclear proliferation, carbon emissions, health pandemics, or creating instead new victims of global displacements: migrants, refugees, exiles, the jobless, the homeless, who simply suffer cosmopolitanism, like the global, as a sort of burden or affliction. A far cry from what is sometimes ridiculed as the class consciousness of world travelers, cosmopolitanism seems in all such cases to refer to the fact that the boundaries of people's lives all over the world are being rethematized by global processes that have not only expanded, willingly or not, the horizon of those people's worlds, but also altered their consciousness of the meanings of those expansions. What has been integral to all these processes has been renewed and intensified exposure to what I will call, for want of a better word, strangers, whether actual or imagined. And exposure to strangers has been, I would also argue, with the help of, among others, world historians, has also been the chief engine of change from the beginning of human history. Thus, I've come to associate cosmopolitanism with being, as I call it, otherwise. And the challenge of being otherwise might be reduced, or at least for today's discussion, we will try to reduce it to a single question. That question would be, what would it take ethically to transform the necessity of living together with so many different so-called others in this world, which we cannot escape, into the possibility of living somewhat better, or at least not worse, which we dare not abandon? I put the question, I'm calling it the cosmopolitan question, this way, essentially to highlight the fact that we do not live in a world organized, for the most part, in relation to a hierarchy of ready-made and ideal solutions, so much as in relation to a world constructed around a hierarchy of recurrent and sometimes almost intractable problems. Yet this is not exactly the way most people in the world believe, or would prefer to believe. Life, they assume, should be arranged in relation to the best answers, not the most persistent difficulties. And this prejudice, which may have seemed to be weakening after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, to take only one moment, only became immensely more extensive and intense as a result of the global event known as 9/11 and the massive set of responses and counter-responses it unleashed. Indeed, as I think many of us might think of it now, the misnamed War on Terror and its many attendant conflicts only generated an equally but misleading war of creeds and convictions that now threaten to drown much thinking about the world and its so-called others in a sea of what might be thought of as fixed ideas. Despite the shift from what we then referred to as a bipolar world to what we now describe as a multipolar world, it is scarcely an exaggeration to say that ideology of a particularly virulent sort now seems to rule, and doctrines, dogmas, demagoguery, all filtered through a symbolically mediated fog of words and images, are, to paraphrase the American thinker Ralph Waldo Emerson, are now in the saddle. As the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche warned, Thomas Jefferson once said something almost identical: convictions can be more of a threat to truth than lies. There is no doubt that religions and sectarianisms of all kinds have played their part in this recourse to extreme, inflexible, often authoritarian thinking worldwide. But its expansion, I think, has had as much to do with the decoupling of religion and culture as of their recoupling. That is, the relationship between ideas and the public world is being reshaped by two interrelated forces associated with globalization. The first is what some people call, it's a fancy word, not very pleasant on the ear, deterritorialization, which enables religious and other ideas to circulate in non-territorial spaces that are thus dissociated from specific locations or grievances and disconnected from any societal or cultural articulations of their meaning. Floating free of any particular interpretive frame of reference, they in effect tend to spread outside and beyond the circuits of inherited knowledge. The communities and crises that once shaped their formation and determined their applications now often have little or no relation to their expression or their authorities. Their authority. They exist almost as free-floating signifiers that can be attached to any cause or conflict. Their efficacy related chiefly to their ability to represent themselves as universalist, incorruptible, unchanging antidotes to a world grown strange and frightening because of what I shall call the usual suspects. By usual suspects, I simply mean things like the collapse of former cultural coherencies, increasing social, economic, and political inequalities, vast demographic movements, accelerated technological change, the normalization of heightened violence and terror, the prospect of irreversible human-made changes to the ecosphere, and the increasing narcissism, as one cultural critic has put it, of minor differences. The second of the irreversible forces associated with globalization is that this umbrella term glosses the terrible price that they have exacted from so many people throughout the world. The term glosses the price so many people have had to pay throughout the world. People clearly are desperate for certitude in an uncertain, divisive world. And absolutisms of almost any kind, right, center, or left, reactionary, traditional, or revolutionary, political, economic, social, or religious, often offer the illusion of refuge and reassurance, as well as of retribution. Whether such conditions inevitably precipitate the spread of new forms of exploitation or oppression or tyranny, they almost force us to ask what chances there are still for the survival of a view of human beings as being capable together, even across immense differences of immense gulfs of difference, misunderstanding, and injury, of engaging not in predatory world rendering or world disordering, but in collaborative world creating and world extending, in what the famous French philosopher Jacques Derrida once called mondialization. Mondialization, or world making and world developing, is the capacity that he believed was endangered by an event like 9/11. And he feared for its recovery, that is, the recovery of these projects of world making and world extending. He feared for its recovery in the face of technologies that not only place implements of devastation in the hands of both state and non-state actors, all too eager to use them, but can set off chain reactions, much like the butterfly effect in physics, of reprisals and revenge seemingly without end. My intention this afternoon is to suggest that we cannot pursue this project of mondialization, of extending the world and the worldwide, unless our commitment to it is matched by a willingness to try to learn how to see, if not precisely how others see, which is impossible, then to see as fully as possible what we might see if we could put ourselves in something like their place, especially when they see us, which is not impossible. That is, we know or can know a good deal more about those we define as strangers or others or different or alien than is assumed either by many of our conventional theories of knowledge or by our own ignorance and indifference. But the task is actually to figure out what can be learned from such knowledge. And this depends, or I will argue it depends, far less on simply accommodating the strangeness of others to ourselves than of using that same strangeness as a means to confront and possibly revise our own. So let's pursue this issue by asking three interrelated questions. Here's where the coals come to Newcastle. First, what do we mean by a global world? And what differentiates it from a so-called international one? Second, what does culture have to do with it? And why is culture so potent and potentially so explosive? And third, what then makes understanding across and between cultures, what I'm calling the Cosmopolitan Challenge, so difficult to achieve, but so crucial to undertake? If we can answer these three questions, then I think we can go a long way toward addressing one of the most fundamental and recurrent challenges for anybody in the 21st century. How to learn how to learn from cultural diversity and conflicts in a world recurrently fractured by difference. That is not what to learn, but how to learn from those differences. So let's start with the term global, which most of us believe we understand well enough. I'm referring, of course, to the increasingly interconnected world around us. A world that is not simply local or regional or national, or for that matter, even just transnational, like the United Nations, or civilizational, but rather a world interactive among all its parts on numerous levels of experience. This, of course, is the world we've known, most of us, ever since we laid our hands on a cell phone, if not before. A world many of whose parts, or at least whose virtual parts, you can access from what almost seems to be the speed of light, thanks to YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Flickr, Instagram, LinkedIn, Cafe Mom, and all the other programs and apps that at least I, if not you, can't use very well. But access, as we all know, is not the same thing as understanding. The technological wizardry that has brought the people of the world into closer proximity to one another, into what feels, perhaps, at least in the palm of one's hands, like a global village, has also increased still more drastically the problems of how to make sense of that world, and what, more critically, to make of each other. It's one thing to discover that time and space can seemingly be compressed with a few simple keystrokes on your iPhone, that Siri can answer a number of one's ultimately least important questions. It's quite another to realize that you are now living in a world where your future may be dependent upon, possibly even determined by, people, problems, and perplexities of which you have little or no knowledge. A world over which whose widening and deepening and speeding up is creating a global universe, many of whose parts are interconnected, but by no means all of whose parts are interdependent. We should not forget, of course, that there are still very vigorous disputes with very large consequences about just when this thing called globalization actually began, or for that matter, how it's best conceptualized, or what in fact does make it work or not work, or whether it has or has not been good for the world and its peoples. The one thing on which many people do agree is that globalization refers, as much as I was suggesting a moment ago, to a set of interactive processes with systematic properties that affect everything from climate change and security regimes, or rather surveillance regimes, to social relations and individual consciousness, as it does to the interplay of discrete but interrelated nation states. To some, this may sound like a contradiction of sorts. What could be more interconnected, you may well be asking yourself, than the international world of nation states, whose founding, at least in the West, goes back to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. This is a world whose formation over the next 150 years or so depended on the structuration of an emerging system of bounded territorial spaces which claim sovereignty within their own realm. Was it not this spreading state system which, despite the asymmetries of power inherent within it, slowly knit the world into an international order that continues in large part to govern, or at any rate to control, most of its interactions? This might be true if the articulations of the state system had not themselves been dependent on various other developments which were by no means exclusively political, even when they served state purposes. I'm thinking of such things as we're all familiar with, like revolutions in economics, or industrialization, or armaments, or transportation, or communications, to, in fact, the growth of a global civil society. Those things were not wholly controlled by states. They, in fact, had much to do with the ways in which states themselves evolved. In short, what has been going on for a long time above nation states as well as below them, and indeed beyond them, has become every bit as consequential for defining world order as what has gone on because of them, because of states. But this then brings us to my second question about what culture has to do with such developments and why it is so volatile and unpredictable. Sorry, I haven't been looking at you, but you're there and I see you. As it happens, some people, I'm afraid too many, merely think of culture as the frosting on the cake of life, the aesthetic icing that compensates, for those who can afford its administrations, for the gross dullness and hardships of experience, indeed of daily living. Others assume culture to be a kind of super reality, like maybe religion or ideology or even law, with purposes and protocols and practices all its own. Still others go the other direction and reduce culture to the brute patterns of collective behavior that are open to observation and measurable by statistics. And yet still more, identify culture with, in the phrase the American military is fond of using, hearts and minds. That is, what one needs to know or believe to operate in a manner acceptable to a group. But culture, actually, and I think in this setting this would be easily shared, culture actually plays a still more central role in human life and society. Its pivotal role derives from the fact that human beings apparently suffer, at least by comparison with most other animals, creatures in the animal kingdom, from a genetic deficiency. Unlike other creatures, human beings are not equipped from birth either with all the information they need or with the requisite skills they need to apply it to interact effectively with the world around them. Instead, they have to acquire that information and those skill sets by learning how to convert the raw materials of their experience into meanings so that they can both make sense of those encounters with experience and also cope with them. Our friend the ant doesn't need to do it, but is much more successful at as a result at living. Culture is the name we give to those meanings as they shape themselves or are shaped by us, by all those who pass them on to us, parents, peers, educators, into systems of interpretation. Systems of interpretation which we can then employ as, in effect, user guides to manage our relations with the world around us. And sometimes, not very often, however, sometimes to shape that world a little bit more to our liking and maybe even our advantage. Hence, in the language of the present moment, culture might be thought of as both a kind of operating system and as a set of software programs to make it work. To be sure, neither the operating system, composed of systems of meaning inherited from the past, nor the software programs, composed of interpretive technologies or stratagems for employing those meanings, come built in, or as we say, come bundled. We have to learn them from the store of systems and technologies our society or societies make available to us. And those stores and instruments are always changing and being revised. Or, again, as our computer, notepad, or cell phone periodically informs us, are in need of being updated. Moreover, it's also true that some of us are better at using these tools than others, like me, less technologically literate. It's also true that some of us are better than the rest of us in employing them in particular frameworks or settings. Business, I'm no good at it. Finance, worse. Sports, not very good at that either. Politics, human relations, mathematics. Fashion, eating, pretty good at that. But for better or worse, none of us can escape our dependency on these systems of felt meaning to read our way through life, precisely because what life mostly confronts us with and requires us to negotiate are the cultural signs, symbols, gestures, scripts, representations, rituals, performances, practices, and requirements by which others, like ourselves, both express and enact themselves. So what, then, more specifically, does culture actually do? Among the many different functions culture performs, let me identify just two that have a direct bearing on my subject about bridging cultural differences in a globalized world. The first function culture performs is to provide us with a sense of what I'll call power, both personal and collective. And culture does so not because, as I've said, it is just a system or complex of behavioral patterns, but also because it is a set of control mechanisms for organizing and governing behavior. Without such control, our behavior, in fact, would remain shapeless, pointless, chaotic. With its assistance, however, our behavior can become not only purposeful, but in its way, inevitably, political. That is to say, cultural forms and technologies enable us to acquire over time a sense of ourselves as actors who have, as a result, what we call an identity. And the more we function effectually with the support of this identity, our sense of ourselves as actors, the more we are likely to become prepared. We are likely to become prepared to assert and even defend that identity against all threats, whether external or, heaven forbid, as most of us have learned from our friendly therapist, internal. Culture, in this sense, is no mere ornament of behavior, but rather its precondition, and even protector. As a mode of power, culture furnishes us both with the terms and with the means to express our interests and desires in a world comprised, from the very beginning, of competing forms of self-assertion, leverage, and competition. The second of the functions that culture performs is to serve as a medium of exchange, actually a kind of currency that can be bartered and traded, indeed is all the time. This is why the cultural universe, operates less like a museum than like a marketplace. Since the cultural universe is composed, as I've noted, of forms of meaning that are defined in part by their import, their significance, they possess value, and in that sense can be thought of literally as a kind of capital or form of wealth. Merely consider how a college degree operates. It is not simply a badge of distinction, it is literally a kind of asset. You can actually statistically identify the more amount of money you will make if you have one, on average. But if culture represents, or can represent, assets that possess value in certain contexts, then people also can and will struggle over the resources it represents. My college degree from this place is more important, more valuable than yours from that place. And it has nothing to do with how much we know or how proud we are, simply it has to do basically with branding. Right? Okay, so either way, struggle over the resources culture represents are then frequently reproduced. The struggle over the resources it represents are reproduced as fights or contests, sometimes referred to as culture wars over what is called symbolic capital. And we're all experts at it. And we're all fabulous negotiators with it. Culture wars over symbolic capital have, of course, gone on throughout the ages and can take many forms, such as the recent and perhaps again forthcoming congressional debate over the closing of the United States government and the raising of the debt limit. Is this American? Is it un-American? Is it good for the economy? Is it bad for the economy? Is it good for the South? Is it bad for the rest of the nation? Whatever it means. But their virulence is multiplied that is, these debates over ending debts, raising debts and closing governments, their virulence is multiplied because the terms of the dispute, me versus Mr. Cruz, so often involve entities that are not empirical so much as metaphorical, figurative, symbolic, in truth, imaginary. What is being contested, to say it again, is the valuation and validation of things that are no less real, no less actual, for being images or perceptions and feelings and the social and political work they do. But this then further reinforces the idea that the realm of the imaginary, both as a content of culture and as an engine for driving it, is not a category mistake, but an actual key to the formation of human identity and the shaping of human history. That much of what we negotiate with, define ourselves in terms of, belong, as I say, not to the realm of the simply empirical, though it affects its reshaping, but of the nature of the imaginary, of what we assume to be the case. To some, this may just sound altogether far-fetched. How can culture, now viewed as, among other things, a kind of imaginary universe, or constellation of universes, in which we are, so to speak, suspended, and by which we try to negotiate our relations with the world around us, how can that be so determinative in the construction and reconstruction of the global, indeed even the international world itself? How can forms of life so often associated with, call it by its right name, poems, narratives, dreams, ceremonies, myths, performances, celebrations, aspirations, intuitions, divinations, how can they have so profoundly helped determine over time the kinds of lives people have sought to live, not just with and for themselves, but with and often at the expense of others? The answer, I'll propose, is to be found in social and political and economic formations all around us. For example, we now speak of nations, which are essentially based on collective senses of identity, as opposed to states, which are based on specific forms of governance. We speak of nations as imagined communities, not because they don't exist, but because the terms of their existence have no simple correspondence with fact. Right? Just as their members, for the most part, remain invisible to each other. How many members of the American nation do any of us know? My friends, do I know how many members of the American nation do any of us really know? But yet we feel we belong to each other. Not only that, so the boundaries that delimit nations, legal boundaries, territorial boundaries, and the senses of sovereignty that define them are impossible to represent except through abstractions, like the law. And the feelings of solidarity, moreover, that bind people in them are based on and expressed through little more than horizontal senses of comradeship, which come into play mainly when we feel it's threatened, as in 9/11. Right? Still more interestingly, the sudden conclusion of the Cold War, I'm sure you've all talked about this a lot, revealed in its aftermath that this conflict, which could have ended life on Earth as we know it, began to appear to political scientists, good ones anyway, not only as a confrontation of opposing powers, which it certainly was, but also as a confrontation of conflicting imaginations and ideological mindsets. James Rossinow spoke for many by arguing that, quote, if weapons buildups and arms races were perpetuated more by unwarranted perceptions and distorted intelligence reports than by actual plans for military offenses, end quote, one was compelled to realize, quote, how fully the course of events are fictions of intersubjective imaginations rather than of objective conditions. But much the same power of the imaginary also helped trigger the recession of 2008, when the gigantic investment bank and securities trading and brokerage firm Bear Stearns was brought down against a run on its reserves that it had already prudently protected itself against. In the face of radical threats to the stock market, Bear Stearns prudently obtained a multi-billion-dollar loan from the Federal Reserve and J.P. Morgan Chase. While this lifeline thus made the firm absolutely flush with cash, the market instead misread that act of prudent borrowing in a time of panic as a sign that the firm was instead suffering from a lack of cash. This market misinterpretation of the bank's real liquidity situation then set off a second, much more devastating run on Bear Stearns' otherwise ample reserves that overwhelmed them. And the rest, as we say, is history. In each of these examples, we see what might be called the logics of the cultural imaginary, determining the way some of the other logics of life, in this case of the geopolitics of national identity and superpower rivalry and the economic logics of the marketplace, how the logics of the cultural imaginary can determine the way the others are read and interpreted. This is not an issue or an argument that proves how the logics of culture always displace those other logics of national identity, international affairs, or finance, but simply demonstrates how cultural logics do so often influence, if not determine, how those other logics are construed and employed. But let's not forget that cultures are by themselves very complex organisms, whose components at any given point or moment are pretty difficult to disassemble, and whose internal logics and power cannot simply be reduced to or identified with any one of those components. Indeed, reading cultural meanings and codes has been likened by the great anthropologist Clifford Geertz to a kind of game, and their interpretation to the process of, say, getting a joke, or grasping a pun, or fathoming a proverb, or reading a poem, or even, in my favorite analogy for it, comprehending baseball. To follow a baseball game, as Geertz pointed out, one must not only understand what a bat is, and a hit, and an inning, and a left fielder, and a squeeze play, and a hanging curve, and a tightened infield, but one must also understand, and crucially, what the game in which these things are components is all about. To comprehend the game, you need to know what is at stake when the play conforms to an accepted structure of rules. Okay? The problem is, this analogy, reading culture like playing a game, such as fathoming a proverb, the problem is that this analogy breaks down what is in cultural life the thing to be known and the character of the knowable, that is, what the game in which these things are elements is all about, change. Because the games are not always strictly rule-governed. Cultures, in fact, are rife with such non-rule-governed games, where complete knowledge, then, that is, again, what the game in which these things are elements is all about, is simply unattainable, perhaps even irrelevant. Here, the point of interpretation, much less the purpose of the play, think about the law, or religion, or politics, or art itself. Much of the purpose of the play is to learn how to use the structure of rules to change, or at any rate to complicate the game, by exploring what is not actually fully knowledgeable or predictable, but can only frequently be inferred and then exploited. These are the meanings and significances that are not fully represented by the structure, that are just simply potential to it. To be sure, such meanings are not easily defined or categorized in any given culture, or for that matter, civilization, because they constitute the horizon of possibilities within which the relations between the known and the knowable, and the unknown and the unknowable are all cast. And we work in those odd, ambiguous places all the time as we try to figure out what our spouse wants, what our kids need, how the hell to get through the next challenge at work. But if these are sometimes the hardest and trickiest meanings to understand in any cultural formation or expression, they can also be, as a matter of fact, the most revealing. In fact, and help, especially when we're interested in determining how the wisdom or insight of one culture can be rendered accessible to that of another. Which brings me then to my third question. The question of what to make of the differences that define a globalized world, and how to bridge them, or at any rate, how to turn them to constructive rather than destructive purpose. For many people in the world, such differences, or the real differences, the ones that truly count, aren't bridgeable at all. They may believe this either because they feel their own traditions and values are inviolate and pure, a common assumption of fundamentalists of one kind or another, or because they are convinced that all civilizations, and thus the cultural systems associated with them, are inherently incompatible and conflicting. The assumption of what I would call civilization clashers. Such claims are often based on the notion that cultures like civilizations are anchored in religions whose boundaries are as fixed as their most rigid orthodoxies, which ain't true. But this is to confuse the beliefs of their adherents of those religions with the behavior of such systems. Religions have always suffered from heterodoxy, not orthodoxy, because they have so often been constructed out of components of other faiths and practices. Religions, like the civilizations with which they are only loosely allied, are clearly, except perhaps in their most official versions of themselves, more fluid, diverse, divided, inconsistent, and above all porous within themselves, not to say between themselves, that the thesis about civilizations and religions always clashing ever allows. Yet these same totalizing prejudices about religions and civilizations also resurface in a more benign but still simplistic and offensive form in much talk these days about Asian values, Muslim practices, Latino beliefs, African customs, or for that matter, American dogmas. What gives the lie to these prejudices is that a great majority of the world's people belong to more than one so-called civilization, and often by choice. That most civilizations are deeply influenced by, and as I was saying before, thus creatures of contributions from other civilizations. That all civilizations are in processes of rapid change, and even of more rapid redescription. That the structures of relation and tension between and among civilizations are arranged at all sorts of oblique angles and crosshatched with diverse lines of pressure and hierarchy and variety. Indeed, it's precisely because of this historicity and mobility and adaptability that even in times of crisis, when their back is, as it were, up against the wall, that civilizations, like cultures, can be repositories of ideas and values that are capable, at least potentially, of being more widely shared, even when variously expressed. But how does that occur? What makes it possible for one culture to learn from the insights of another? I'm going to propose that there are 3 steps to that process. Very simple, not very difficult to achieve. The first step in the process of understanding other cultures involves an act of what we might call deciphering, of reading, of, to give it the right name, interpretation itself. But what's novel about that interpretation is that it does not depend on the fusion of one mind or culture with another. It doesn't mean that we have to become others to understand them. Lovely idea, very romantic, both in terms of the century in which it came into being, but also in terms of our notions about what love is really like. But the challenge is rather not of fusing the mind of the interpreter with the mind of the interpreted or interpretable. It's rather something different, to try to figure out what the so-called other's mind or culture or civilization is up to or actually seeks. What is it in general about, for which I don't have to become them? The second step in this process, though, entails an act, inevitably, of translation, by which we convert the practice's performance of one mind, culture, or civilization, that is, what I'm thinking they're up to, back into the idioms of my own, so that I can in fact assess them. This step actually holds out more possibilities for misreading than the first, because we can only grasp, frankly, what to some degree we can analogize, even if that operation of analogizing only succeeds in defamiliarizing what we think we already know. Yet, complete understanding of whatever it is that we seek to comprehend from across cultural divides remains incomplete without a third and crucial step. It's not a question of simply trying to the best of our ability to divine or determine what we think they are up to, and then translate that knowledge back into things that make sense to us given our own frameworks of understanding. The third step is what we might call appropriation. Here is where one attempts to gauge the difference that such translations make to one's previous self-understanding and the internal adjustments we must make as a consequence. Without this final step, I would argue, the interpretive process remains incomplete, and the possibility of achieving new understandings, as in fact our children have frequently reminded us, remains permanently thwarted. Right? Dad, if this doesn't change you by me telling me what I'm like, you don't understand it. What makes this interpretive process so difficult to complete, in its 3 still may sound like abstract steps, is that, of course, most of us don't want to change our minds at all, or very much. Don't want to alter our understanding too drastically. Even if it can be shown that interaction with others is crucial to personal self-development, and in truth, as I mentioned at the outset, the basic motor of all historical development, most of us are content to keep things pretty much as they are. We may crave a little variety to escape from boredom, but most of us also fear the really different. After all, the really different presents a challenge to our senses of ourselves. And our senses of ourselves, that is our identity, is the key to our power, and thus, as we said, to our sense of worth or value. To lose or even risk that sense of identity threatens the self with an experience, as Freud once pointed out, with an experience of impoverishment, of diminishment, which can indeed turn the self angry, even vengeful. Hence, the potentially symbiotic relationship between the threat of new understanding and the feeling of aggression. And if the loss of former understanding is widely shared, then the aggression provoked by its loss can quickly be socialized and politicized into forms of violence intimately linked with, eventually, rites of sacrifice, where the shedding of blood, somebody's blood, becomes essential to the preservation of the social or political bond. But this shedding of blood, we also know, can do more than simply preserve the social world from destruction. It can, and often does, also bind the sacrificers into a community of ritual cleansers. In the extreme, the community can be saved through the ritual practice of scapegoating, that practice we learned in the sandbox, where the social fabric is preserved by allowing the community to realign itself around the common repudiation of some victim, right? The guy who had the big head in the sandbox was to be thrown out because nobody wanted to think they looked like that themselves. That victim is then held responsible for aggression against the community, but the community can be preserved because a surrogate has been found to divert and absorb its violence. From this perspective, scapegoating and the sacrifice it ritualistically promotes is perceived as, if not the remedy for violence, then a means for containing it. But this may underestimate the therapeutics of scapegoating itself, which are not simply vivisectionist, cutting off the infected body, right? The diseased limb or member, but also purgative, sanitizing the body that remains. As a ritual technology that allows one to project onto others what one potentially fears or despises in oneself, migrants, for example, the social, cultural, and political therapy of scapegoating not just protects the community from the threat of pollution, but also cleanses and purifies it, thereby making ritual sacrifice, even perpetual war, the key to social survival and redemption. Part of the challenge for cross-cultural understanding, then, is how to reverse these cycles of violence that can be generated whenever people couple the dogmatization or the absolutizing of their own identity with, or in terms of, the disparagement or demonization of the identity of others. How does one forestall or prevent the self from turning the so-called other into a radical opposite in order to inoculate itself against change? The answer, I think, is to be found in the fact that notions of self and other, so easy to use loosely, even of identity and difference, are not given with nature, but are constructed by culture. Far from being ontological entities, right, inscribed in the very structure of being itself, they are symbolic categories that tell us as much about the people who create and employ them as about the people they can differentiate and possibly stigmatize. To view them as creations rather than discoveries, however, is then to comprehend that how such notions can, and perhaps should, function in part as reflexive mirrors that refract back to the self employing them undetected aspects of itself. Put another way, such constructions can reveal to us that the basis of our deepest connection with others may not be our similarity to them, so much as our foreignness to ourselves. Such recognitions, and I'm now just about done, ultimately bring us back to the intersubjective nature of not just the formation of selves, but as well of cultures, both of which develop in part only because of their ability to see themselves from the perspectives of others. But seeing from the perspective of others is not the same thing as seeing as or what they see. Instead, it is a matter of trying to discern what can be seen if we could, so to speak, put ourselves in their place, if we could, rather than they in ours. Putting ourselves in someone else's place, insofar as that place can be reconstructed through observation, study, imagination, and empathy. Putting ourselves in someone else's place is not the same thing as putting ourselves in their skin, or seeing with their eyes, much less adopting their beliefs, or, for that matter, sharing their feelings. It is rather a way of determining, but this can be everything, of determining how the coordinates of our own self-understanding might change if we were to place elements of the experience of others on its map. This is the recognition on which I think cosmopolitanism depends, which is difficult but by no means impossible to achieve, only because of the differences and equalities it must traverse, only because of the differences and inequalities it must traverse, the entrenched ideological solidarities it must breach, the injuries of fate and policy it must strand, if it is to be anything more than an empty gesture of deference that eases the conscience of the favored. The fact that cosmopolitanism is easy to disparage or dismiss does not discount the fact that without a deepened and enlivened sense of what binds us to all those by whom we are neighbored, who do come within the ken of our experience, we will continue to fail to become otherwise. The challenge is not so much to make cosmopolitanism more universal, or more context sensitive, or for that matter, more practical, but to make universalisms, contextualisms, and practice more cosmopolitan. So,
Thank you.
I'll leave it there.